Okay, we're good to go.
All right, perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. This is now our 7th seminar for the School of Materialist Research. Today we have a lecture by Katerina Kolozova, Marx versus Hegel. And before I introduce her, I just want to say thanks again to everyone.
We're good to go.
Okay, all right, perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. This is now our... Sorry about that. I had the live stream on at the same time. Yeah, so thanks everyone who's been here for all of them or just the first one. This is the last of the May seminars, but there'll be seminars for June and July that will be announced very soon. So I will introduce the school and then introduce Katerina, and then we can begin. So the School of Materialist Research is an informal graduate and postdoc level program that offers seminars and workshops that address the materialisms running through contemporary science, philosophy, art, mathematics, design, architecture, and politics. It is an international platform founded by the Center for Philosophical Technologies at Arizona State University, the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, the Department for Architecture, Theory, and Philosophy of Technics at TU Wien, and the Critical Inquiry Lab at the Design Academy Eindhoven. It functions as a global online school, combining education, research, and mentorship that advances academic study at the intersection of the social sciences, humanities, and STEM sciences. And Katerina Kolozova is a PhD, director of the Institute in Social Sciences and Humanities Skopje, and a professor of philosophy, epistemology, and gender studies at ISSHS, and also at the University American College Skopje. She is also visiting professor at several universities in Southeastern Europe, most notably at the Department of Political Studies of FMK Belgrade. In 2009, Kolozova was a visiting scholar at the Department of Rhetoric at the University of California, Berkeley, under the peer supervision of Professor Judith Butler, and is the author of The Cut of the Real, Subjectivity and Post-Structuralist Philosophy, which was released in 2014 with Columbia, Toward a Radical Metaphysics of Socialism, Marx and Laruelle, which was released in 2015 with Punctum Books, After the Speculative Turn, Realism, Philosophy, and Feminism, which was co-edited with Eileen Joy, with Punctum Books in 2016. Her most recent monograph was published with Bloomsbury Academic in 2019, entitled Capitalism's Holocaust of Animals, a non-Marxist critique of capital, philosophy, and patriarchy. She is also the author of numerous interdisciplinary policy studies dedicated to the issues of illiberal democracy, autocratic mechanisms of state capture and hybrid regimes, policy critique of repressive technocracy, and the legislation of the authoritarian neoliberal post-socialist states in Europe. So with that, Katerina, if you're ready, we can start.
Yeah, of course. All right, so thanks, Zach. Let me begin. This is a longer paper. I'll begin from this point of the discussion, where this juxtaposition between Marx and Hegel is most clearly established, and we'll take the conversation from there. And it's the discussion revolves around the question of modernity and how the two strands of thought, what one would call the Marxian or Marxist proper thinking, and what incurred as orthodox Marxism immediately afterwards, approaches the question of modernity, and the Hegelian, and I would say, of course, in spite of Agon's discussion yesterday, the idealist line of thinking approaches the same subject, that of and phenomenon, that of modernity. So refracting the vectors of modernity through the lens of non-philosophy. Yeah, all of this is of course this entire discussion and this juxtaposition that I am establishing, introducing here, is of course mediated with the methods of non-philosophy, Laruellian non-philosophy. Okay, so I intend to propose a comparative reading of two perspectives of the notion of subjectivity and its centrality for the legacy of modernity, that both purport the possibility to think of or in relation to the real, albeit, so both are realist, let's say, tentatively call them that way, the both traditions, albeit by admitting its radical foreclosure, the real's radical foreclosure, that of non-Marxism on the one hand, and the emerging ideas of universalism in response to post-structuralist particularism, stemming from and gravitating around the works of mainly Ljubljana School, Slavoj Žižek, and other appropriations in political philosophy today, appropriations of Hegel in political philosophy today. So non-Marxism is, let us explain briefly, an approach to Marxism inspired by the method provided by François Laruelle, called non-philosophy or non-standard philosophy, that seeks to radicalize what it identifies as both the scientific and realist core in Marxist thought, that of Marx. It is realist, or rather correlating with the real, in the way Laruelle uses the word correlation, which is completely different from mesus. So it is realist, or rather correlating with the real, without establishing amphibology between the real and thought, by way of reading Marxism of philosophy, or rather the principle of philosophical sufficiency, as Laruelle would put it. In what follows, we will provide an explication of what the principle of philosophical sufficiency refers to as conceptualized by François Laruelle, whereas at the moment, suffice it to say that it is comparable to Marx's extolling of the principle of praxis over that of philosophy as a critique of the philosophical self-mirroring, a thesis that pervades critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, published by Marx, what one might call the young Marx, but also the later Marx. We find the same thesis in later Marx, like in German ideology, thesis on Feuerbach, and passages in Grundrisse from different periods of time. So the self-mirroring thought philosophy is, at least according to the Laruellians, and to a considerable extent according to Marx himself, we will demonstrate now how come. So the self-mirroring thought philosophy subsumes the real itself, reducing it to a postulate, to its transcendental aspect exclusively, rather than reversing the hierarchy whereby thought submits to the real, albeit radically foreclosed for philosophy's totalizing ambition. Instead of revisiting the dialectics between thought and the real, or reviving a Kantian dilemma, in his critique of Feuerbach's materialism and the critique of Hegel's philosophy under the aforementioned several titles, in particular in critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, Marx proposes that a shift toward objectivism would prefer a proper foundation for a truly scientific discussion of human reality. It is probably an indisputable fact that subjectivity-centered thinking and anthropocentric ontology, epistemology, and morality has determined the civilizational legacy of modernity. The dominant one Just a second. Of modernity. It begins with Kant's practical philosophy and metaphysics of morals. If we must choose a single philosophical threshold in the Western history of ideas, certainly it coincides with the birth of republicanism as the model state promulgated by the French and the American Revolution, and the completion of the Enlightenment project. Kant's own vision could, however, only develop into a liberal or individual-centered foundation of a rationally organized society, and a society that presumes it is moved by invisible yet rational forces immanent to it. The individual is one's own sovereign, metaphysical, political, and legal materialization of the cogitum modeled foundation of human subjectivity and its metaphysics. The Republican sovereign is the sum of such individuals called the nation. In contradistinction, the Enlightenment project also led to a form of reason that has called itself objective and scientific. Just a second. In fact, scientific breakthroughs, stricto sensu, that emerged as part of the Enlightenment did bring forth a form of reason that sought to achieve objectivity, grounded different variants of objectivity, nonetheless orbiting around the notion of objectivity, grounded in a materialist episteme and empirical study, whereas reading thought of metaphysics has been its goal from the onset. So, this legacy and its ambition of achieving objectivity has been also haunted by the impossible task of reading its own tenets from any remnants of metaphysics. So philosophers close to these traditions espoused the ambition of transcending metaphysics, but also much of what remains of philosophy itself, once one had engaged in the task of overcoming metaphysical constraints of thought, which culminated in Wittgenstein. In spite of the ambitions of philosophy and the social sciences, the possibilities of objectivity and scientific exactitude have remained reserved for the natural and the exact sciences, whereas what came to be the humanities, as well as the social sciences, has been struggling to rid itself from the subjective perspective ever since. With the emergence of post-structuralism, this constantly frustrated efforts seized by way of transforming them into the realization that not ceased, as in stopped, by way of transforming them into the realization that not only in the humanities and the social sciences, not only in philosophy, but even in the sciences themselves, one was unavoidably subjective. All of this is grounded, of course, in the Kantian premise. I call this a transformation instead of a shift, because counterintuitively to its purported ambition, the affirmation of thought's ultimate impossibility to fully account of the real is premised on the realization about the impossibility to achieve absolute objectivity. Considering the expectation of absoluteness, so the expectation of absoluteness, and thus the criterion of the absolute are in place, in spite of the admitted impossibility, the reasoning of this type remains entrapped in philosophical metaphysics. To paraphrase François Laruelle, the equation real equals fiction has been replaced by fiction equals real, but the equation is still the same. In other words, deconstruction, the Deleuzian theory, and the entire continental tradition of the linguistic turn in philosophy have merely put the entire structure of the classical philosophical tradition upside down while remaining constricted by the laws of that very same culture, I meant structure, but it's written culture. To conclude, an account of what is objective, to what extent and in what sense, has remained an impossibility for the post-structuralist episteme, and it is so because an account of absolute metaphysical certainty of it is treated as impossible. So the absolute metaphysical certainty is treated as impossible. Therefore, the ambition is dismissed. In such an expectation that is absolute, so the expectation is of absolute, the concession of impossibility is absolute too. And the premise of absoluteness has therefore not been abandoned. And this is the problem of structuralism. Has been and is still. So nonetheless, there emerged discourses of both modernity and objectivity in the 19th century that pleaded for an objective point of view, such as positivism, logical empiricism, and Marxism. So here we will focus on Marxism. Positivism, let's say, is just a phantasm entrapped in the old metaphysical presuppositions. Logical empiricism is interesting, but has certain limitations that I've discussed elsewhere, and we also have to choose one, so we choose Marxism. So we will focus here on Marxism, or rather Marx's original writings, and the way they approached with, or rather Marx's, the ways in which Marx's original writings approached the epistemic scaffold provided, with the help of the epistemic scaffold provided by Laruelle and Nonphilosophy. So objectivity as an inherently materialist criterion of scientific relevance, according to Marx, in his critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, neither seeks to emulate the exact sciences nor espouse positivism, insofar as it is anthropocentric, positivism itself, and thus retains a non-scientific episteme. Marx's vision, this is my paraphrase and extension of Marx's point. I will quote Marx's point in a moment. Marx's vision is epistemologically positioned beyond what he called a Hegelian legacy of subjectivity-centered thought. This is his key issue with Hegel. And, epistemological break notwithstanding, or something which I do not subscribe to, a notion, understanding and reading of Marx, I do not subscribe to. According to me, there is no such thing. But nevertheless, even if it were, this critique of subjectivity-centered thought that emerged in the original critique of Hegel of the young Marx pervades his entire opus. He pleads for an epistemological position beyond what he called the Hegelian legacy of subjectivity-centered thought that entertains idealism, even when cloaked as materialism. This is the reason for his critique of Feuerbach. That's what it amounts to. So the chief defect he says in the thesis on Feuerbach, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, that of Feuerbach included, is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as a sensuous human activity practice, but rather subjectively. Hence, in contradistinction to materialism, the active side was developed abstractly by idealism. So this is where idealism sneaks into Feuerbach's materialism. And this is why he's object of this critique. So the active side was developed abstractly by idealism, which of course does not know real sensuous activity as such. Marx's vision of modernity has never been that of human subjectivity structured thought. So interestingly, actually his early phase, the young Marx, which is often called the humanist phase, is arguing for a non-anthropocentric perspective of thinking, of overcoming the epistemic constraint and metaphysical flaws of the subjectivity-centered thought that issued from both idealism and any form of philosophy, actually. Because as he moves further with the critique of Feuerbach, he comes down to, his critique comes down to the conclusion that Feuerbach remains entrapped in idealism precisely because he continues being a philosopher. Interestingly, it's his humanist phase is radically non-anthropocentric. Even though he talks about the radical human, of the radical human, he speaks of a certain reconciliation of human with nature, etc., as the path of communism. And I must note, this is not really a characteristic only of the young Marx, because this proposal, this vision, reappears in the manifesto. If you remember, there is just one sentence, one passage there, which talks of this reconciliation. No epistemic breaks here either, but nonetheless, let's concede to this presupposition, and let's say there is such thing, and we're talking of young Marx. So in young Marx, we can identify this, fixation on, the relevance of the human insofar as species being of humanity, and at the same time, it's certain metaphysical tasks of communism, I would say, such as that return to nature, for example, but also this radically non-anthropocentric episteme that he proposes. So this is the humanism of early Marx. I don't know. I think it is. I think that also the Western canon of Marxism also makes this distinction between, or it has this taxonomy, like the early and humanist Marx, and then the last humanist one, as we used to have it in former Yugoslavia. And for example, Praxis school was based on early Marx. So, but there we do not see that insistence on humanism. I think that's a Western reading, or at least humanism is not treated in the same way. Anyway, this was a digression from the paper. So Marx's vision of modernity has never been that of human subjectivity structured thought. So the structure itself is centered around the notion of subjectivity, which can be nothing but human subjectivity. Even if we imagine some transhuman subject beyond it, it's still modeled on and structurally conditioned on the human subject. So this was also a digression, a comment. Now I'm returning to the paper. So Marx's vision of modernity has never been that of human subjectivity structured thought, which, even when pretending to be objective, remains immanently idealist, according to Marx. Marx's project of dismantling Hegel's philosophical and political project as one issuing from and amounting to the ideal of a universal egoist, to paraphrase Marx, also from the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general. This remark of the universal egoist is there, ends up as a radical critique both of Hegel's notion of political state and concomitant conceptualization of secularism, which we find in his paper on Bruno Bauer and the Jewish question. So in Karl Marx's political philosophical project, subjectivity, political state, and secularism, all these three are not what a modern society should consist in, but quite the opposite. Their transcendence by way of sublation when confronted with the materialist objective science of the species being of humanity. Secularism is, argues Marx in the Jewish question, a name for a political state that has alienated itself from the society precisely, and here again we find his critique of Hegel. This one is very direct, I would say, frontal. A name for a political state that has alienated itself from the society precisely by way of relegating everything pertaining to the individual to the so-called civil society. Let us just note another footnote, so a digression from the paper. I've discussed this elsewhere, so I'll just comment briefly here. Marx is not invoking some, revival of authenticity, return to the authentic true self and essence of humanity. He is not Heidegger. So his appeal or plead is not of that sort. Alienation of some sort is unavoidable. It is actually, it's what social relations stand on. It's the basis of social relations. It's what he problematizes is the second alienation, which camouflages and obfuscates the first one, lies about it, let's put it that way. And that's usually done through the procedure of reification. And reification is when the abstract pretends to be the real, or to be real, even naturalized, rendered physical. I've found not Lukács's book, but actually a paper from Gajo Petrovic, a Yugoslav Marxist of the Praxis group, most useful in the elucidation of what the problem of reification is to Marx. How could we put it in German? Verdingligung, or something like that. Making things look like, making abstract stuff look like it's a thing. So anyway, so this was just a footnote. So it's his appeal to return to nature, you know, his vindication of use value as opposed to surplus value, his re-emerging constant critique of alienation, etc., is not about some return to some authentic truth, or I don't know, immanent plane or whatever. It's more about a different treatment of the unavoidable abstraction and the alienation it entails. So that's why he speaks of different organization of social relations, where we would not have this schism between the political state and the so-called civil society, which this division, on the other hand, this division is unavoidable if we follow Hegel to the letter, and he proves this in the paper on Bauer and the Jewish question. So quote, because I'm still on the third page. There is not much time. Actually, there is half an hour, so I'll read a part of it at least. So the relation of the political state, this is a quote from Marx, the relation of the political state to civil society is just as spiritual as the relations of heaven to earth. The political state stands in the same opposition to civil society, and it prevails over the latter in the same way as religion prevails over the narrowness of the secular world. So, by likewise having always to acknowledge it, to restore it, and allow itself to be dominated by it, in his most immediate reality, in civil society, man is a secular being. Here, where he regards himself as a real individual and so regarded by others, he is a fictitious phenomenon. In the state, on the other hand, where man is regarded as a species being, he is the imaginary member of an illusory sovereignty and is deprived of his real individual life as endowed with an unreal universality. So, this split should be overcome. I would say Marx is never explicit about this, but his idea is, I think, that the state and in a supposed just a second, supposed communist context, a state and civil society would not be divided. There wouldn't be such a split. There would be a unity between what one could be as an individual and as a member of collective in the civil society, where religion and the rest is relegated, and what one is in the political state. So the split between the purely political state and the civil society is immanently bourgeois. maintaining an alienation of the citizen from the reality of the social relations taking place in the civil society, but also an alienation of the private person from the role of citizen. This is a paraphrase of Pauline Crochet, her paper from 2014, a reading of what she calls Marx's attempt to radicalize the liberal project of the young Hegelians. So Slavoj Žižek, for example, on the other hand, argues that subjectivity-centered reason and secularism lie at the core of modernity. So this is his interpretation of modernity. Modernity is about subjectivity-centered reason and secularism. He says, it is absolutely crucial for emancipatory politics to remain faithful to the universalist secular project of modernity. And a bit further in the same text, in Less Than Nothing, he prefers an addition to this definition by saying pre-modern organic society, and for example, what Marx argues for is this organic state that is also, let's say, a materialization of society, what would have been split and in Hegel and relegated to the realm of the so-called civil society, so the culture of civil society. So the pre-modern organic society that denies the infinite right of subjectivity as the fundamental feature of modernity. He repeats this again. He's most probably right when one looks at the liberal democratic tradition based on the idea of the Republican Enlightenment inspired idea of modernity. Yet, I argue there are insufficiently explored niches of alternative possibilities for the modernist political, epistemic, and onto-metaphysical potential predicated on the aforementioned critique forwarded by Marx. Let us explore now an abstraction such as humanity, how an abstraction such as humanity can be rendered real, preferred a materialist account of it, albeit while affirming the realness of its abstract nature. And in doing so, avoiding the trap of idealism as well as anthropocentrism. In order to do so, one ought to embrace Marx's notion of objectivity and consider social relations as objects among objects, seen from a third party's perspective, a concept we will elaborate now. So humanity is an abstraction that is real, but that does not mean it's a self-standing idea, as one would imagine it in both a Hegelian context and the post-structuralist context. It is rather what we might call a real abstraction, borrowing the term from Zohn-Rethel, constituting the species being of humanity. Such abstractions are called real by the Austrian Marxist epistemologist Alfred Zohn-Rethel. Regardless of the fact that an abstract category such as humanity, but also labor, value, is predicated on a material reality that is its embodiment and an ontological property, it is also real in and of itself insofar as an abstraction. By affirming its realness as an abstraction, one does not fall back into idealism, but quite to the contrary, its real abstractness is affirmed as well as its material effects. They're always material effects. However, the real abstraction of species being of humanity, or Gattungswesen, is not an ersatz entity. It is not Lucia in Aristotelian sense. It is yet again a product of human cognitive labor that is inhabited by incalculable number of physical bodies and should be addressed as such, as that reality shaping and instituting category it is. By decentering scientific thought from humanity as its legislating principle, as its teleological sense, by transcending the anthropocentric limitations of a posture of thought structured in line with the empty form of subjectivity that nonetheless emerges from humanist semantics, Marx pushes us further in the direction of post-humanism than constructivist discourse ever did. On the other hand, such a procedure of decentering does not imply anti or transhumanism. It remains radically humanist, as Marx keeps arguing, but in the sense I just explained above, in the sense of the real abstraction I just explained. So it remains radically humanist, as Marx keeps arguing, and not only in his early works. As I said, consider Grundrisse, the Communist Manifesto, etc., as object of study among other objects of study. So, as Laruelle would say, as an identity of the last instance. In the last instance, okay, it's a determination of the last instance is a borrowed term from Engels, where we know by Althusser, but identity of the last instance would be, this is the thing in the we are talking of in the last instance. So when we talk of humanity, argues Marx, we are being humanists in terms of his methodology or epistemic framework in this sense that I just explained. So as object of study among other objects of study, so a certain identity of the last instance, humanity, seen in its very material foundations of social relations, because social relations also have material foundations, as real abstractions. So seen in its very material foundations of social relations insofar as real abstractions. So these the social relations would be the real abstractions. Returns to nature as realization of human existence. So he writes, Marx, in Private Property and Communism, the human aspect of nature exists only for social man. For only then does nature exist for him as a bond with man, as his existence for the other and the other's existence for him, and as the life element of human reality. Only then does nature exist as the foundation of his own human existence. Only here has what is to him his natural existence become his human existence, now alienated and rendered social. And nature becomes man for him. This realization is possible through communist resolution of the fundamental contradictions of capitalism. Humanity's estrangement from nature, materialized as social relations of a political economic base, but also of a metaphysics pertaining to said base, inextricably constituting one another. Building on the non-idealist or perhaps anti-idealist basis of modernity, we might explore a possibility for the left that builds on Marx's scientific project, which is, however, something quite different and more often than not at odds with the tradition of scientific Marxism in Leninist vein. Here, we're engaged, and also let's be a bit technical about this. Orthodox Marxism is what we have prior Lenin. So, I would say it ends with Plekhanov. Scientific Marxism in Leninist vein. Here, we are engaged in a reading of Marxist authorship. And in this process, we are aided by the methodological instruments furnished by François Laruelle and Alfred von Rettel. Now, I don't know if I have the time to explain this part as well. So, Marxian objectivity of the subject from the perspective of von Rettel's epistemology. So von Rettel's epistemology relies on one simple premise, a materialist methodology. Science and the science of the species being of humanity, more specifically, including political economy, must have a materialist account of the abstractions that constitute human lives. Social relations, economy being part of it, insofar as human productivity, are abstractions that have a real or material effect on human realities, as well as on other forms of living and non-living physical reality, like, products for use or of-use value. So economic reductivism is not part of the reasoning we propose building on Marx's and von Rettel's texts. Economic analysis is always political economic, and it's intrinsic to a particular worldview, or simply a metaphysical position of some sort. So that's why when we talk about class, economy, etc., through Marx, via von Rettel, we're not reducing anything to anything in the way economic production takes place. The entire worldview, so the superstructure is embedded. It pervades it as a metaphysical position of some sort. That sort of a thing is unavoidable. A worldview, some philo-fiction of some sort is unavoidable. So, or put in Marx's own words that do not include the word metaphysical, it is described as follows. This is from Lisa. To the extent that we're considering it here as a relation distinct from that of value and money, capital is capital in general. That is, the incarnation of the qualities which distinguish value as capital from value as pure value or as money. Value, money, circulation, prices are presupposed, as is labor. This is metaphysics here already. Value, labor, what constitutes labor and why is labor abstracted is based on a certain metaphysical presupposition. This is my injecting into the quote I'm reading. So value, money, circulation, prices, etc. are presupposed as is labor. But I'm continuing with the quote, but we're still concerned neither with a particular form of capital nor with an individual capital as distinct from other individual capitals. We are present at the process of its becoming. This dialectical process of its becoming is only the ideal expression of the real movement through which capital comes to being. The later relations are to be regarded as developments coming out of this germ. As argued, let us underscore a position on human alienation, a possible eschatology of its resolution through a return to nature, is also a metaphysical stance. I've elaborated this argument in detail elsewhere. At the moment, suffice it to say, one's belief in human progress through technology, even the very belief in progress, is not only ideology, but also metaphysics, and therefore not even sciences can avoid metaphysics entirely. What keeps them moving is the dictum that there must be progress, and the liberal dictum that there must be endless inquiry in the name of science is already a metaphysical position. So they should not, and political too, and inherently liberal. So they should not be, I'm not against science, by the way, quite the opposite, nor is Marx, as we know. His project is all about establishing a new type of science, and Laruelle's as well. So they should not be seeking to do so either, as metaphysical quizzing is what moves sciences and overall human productivity. One can, however, read this process of the problem called principle of philosophical sufficiency and move away from this entrapment. We actually have problem with this principle of philosophical sufficiency more with that than with, you know, the metaphysical prime mover of every thought. So to affirm that an abstraction such as social relations of value is a reality in its own right, however, does not mean that there is no material or physical determination of the last instance. Laruelle Althusser. The determination of the last instance should not be confused with essence or substance or purpose or reason of being, of the forms of physical reality, of objects of scientific inquiry. It is simply the determination of the last instance in the sense I discussed previously, in the sense of that identity of the last instance as an epistemological tool, let's put it that way. So I choose to refer to forms of physical reality due to the fact that nature is a notion heavily indebted to philosophy and theology as a form of philosophy. An argument brought forth by authors such as Donna Haraway, for example, but also those associated with the so-called speculative turn, for example, in the work of the non-philosopher and Paul Smith. I also tend to avoid the use of material, even though I do not insist on discarding its use entirely. For the same reasons Marx avoided it, and because of the critique of Feuerbach I presented at the beginning, and instead resorted to the terms real and physical, sometimes sensuous too, in order to circumvent the possibility of being mistakenly assumed to espouse the spontaneous use of philosophical materialism of the young Hegelians. The core of this critique is the argument that Feuerbach remains entrapped in a form of idealism because his materialism is subjected to the same legislating principle that found and governed philosophy, all philosophy, its apex being Hegel, a central legislating principle that institutes philosophy as a vicious circle of autoreferentiality. I'm sorry, I have a cat around here messing around the computer. Katniss, go. Autoreferentiality, a view comparable to Laruelle's critique of the principle of sufficient philosophy, is, argues Marx in his critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, as noted above, the centrality of the notion of subjectivity. So it's not like he is saying there is no such thing as subjectivity. The problem is the centrality and the legislating status of this notion. So demonstrating that it is always already human subjectivity, unavoidably so. There is no abstract subjectivity that has not been abstracted from the human subjectivity and its models. So even if semantically emptied of human content, subjectivity, in particular in Hegel's phenomenology, can be but human due to the very structural conditioning of thought. In other words, here we can maybe note where the deficiencies of the so-called neo-rationalism lie. In other words, philosophy cannot escape the form of idealism, and that is why philosophical materialism, be it Feuerbachian or Hegel-inspired Leninist materialism, is merely different semantics filling up the same structure, that of idealism. In order to overcome this problem and move philosophy towards science of humanity's species being, Marx argues an Ausgang, exit from philosophy, is required. This is in, I don't know which one I have. I just have the year of the publication. I think it's the early works. So Marx's own work, the execution of his project in Capital and Grundrisse, is a demonstration of how one departs from philosophical abstractions. So moves away from them, from philosophical abstractions that are in fact generalizations, or what Laruelle problematizes as ensemblism in tetralogos. So philosophically spontaneous as abstractions, cumulative imaginary projections combining science, philosophy, common sense, and mythology of the quotidian in a vague assemblage of a manifest image of reality, as some might call it, only to arrive at the concreteness that constitutes them. So he does not depart from the abstract and moves to the concrete. He moves away from the abstract and starts from the concrete in order to extract a formal abstraction. This permits an extraction of abstractions in the methodological, not ontological sense, extrapolations of formalized and formalizable notions from the examined material reality, as we witness him doing in Capital in all of the 3 volumes, first or third, regardless. So the prerequisite for such a posture of thought and an ensuing process of scientific operation that nonetheless departs from philosophy is to shift the position of the philosophical gaze, to carry out a non-Euclidean shift, and thus do away with subjectivity-centered thought. So I'll stop here. It's much longer. I think this is enough for some coherent presentation. There is more elaboration as I move further. This is just half the paper. So, but I think, it does constitute a certain coherent whole. I can stop here. And before the discussion, can I go get some water?
Yes, of course.
Exactly.
All right, yeah, so while she gets some water, if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand and we'll get to them when she gets back, or you can put them in the chat and I can read them out. So I see that Adam has a question, so we can, or is it a clap? And we can start there, and then, oh, Davor as well, yeah. The old clap hand wave confusion. So we'll begin with Davor then.
Testing.
Yeah, just wait a second till she's.
Okay, but I'm just testing if you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's working, I think.
Okay.
Zdravo, druže.
Ja, dobar dan, gospođo.
Hvala.
Katerina, listen, can you please do me a favor and can you please follow, how should I say, tell me what was your aim of your talk? You know, what did you want to point out? I mean, I know that you had a conclusion kind of, but what did we gain now by seeing this? In what direction did it go? Because I kind of missed the point, I think.
Then I missed the point too.
No,
if it's completely unclear what I meant to say.
No, I think I got the gist, but somehow I didn't get the end. You know, I was taking notes, so I didn't get. You wanted to save. You wanted to show that there are more. That there is more in Marx to reflect modernity than usually is thought. Did I get this?
No. That there is. First of all, I wanted to distinguish Marx from Hegel. There is an entire tradition, this is the dominant tradition, quite contrary to what Argon argued yesterday. I claim that throughout the 20th century and even nowadays, we see some sort of a spontaneous merging of the two traditions of Marxist thought or Marxian tradition and Hegel, and it's you know, the diamat, after all, the dogma of dialectical materialism is that Marx is essentially the materialist variant of Hegel. So my point was to first prove that that's not the case, that actually Marx opposed Hegel throughout his entire opus. He opposed him on several points. He had good reasons on several points to oppose him. One of them being this problem of subjectivity-centered thought I insisted on. Yeah. So, and his project of establishing a science of humanity as objective, so entailed a formulation of a new, completely different from the other possibilities of that era, form of objectivism. So positivism is again centered around, you know, the human subject and its capacity of knowledge, and you know, it's focused on what the subject can grasp, control, etc. It's, you know, we are thinking from this perspective, simply shifting the perspective and looking at human subjectivities as objects among objects, or, you know, the genus, the totality of humanity, for example, as object among other objects of inquiry, is a different move than the move Kant undertakes in his project of positivism. So my point was, first of all, to establish these facts, then to take Marx's side on this issue, because I do think that we remain trapped in an unproductive form of philosophy that cannot have a proper dialogue with the sciences unless we move away from this subjectivity-centered thought.
Okay. this is
Okay.
the question that I was, so
Mhm.
where is the use, so to speak? Is it just a comparison between Hegel and Marx, or does it have some sort of?
It does have, but
Oh, I see.
I think, we have the time to open the questions. If you want, I can send you the paper and you can see what I propose as a solution. I hope I hinted at the solution here. It all seeks to, kind of revive this original project of Marx and enable us to speak of, the political reality in Marxist materialist terms, moving beyond what is currently, I would say, the liberal dogma, even though liberal is not always a negative term, but in this case, we are talking of a certain liberal tradition that I find problematic, that Marx would find problematic. So this liberal dogma, which is centered on identities, on subjectivities, etc., and the structural analysis, structural mobilization, political mobilization becomes impossible. Internationalization of the socialist cause is impossible due to this identity determined particularisms. So all of this has these deeper roots, and I think that this confrontation of Marx and Hegel on this point of subjectivity-centered thought is critical in order to elucidate this problem and equip us epistemologically with different political possibilities. So that's the purpose, let's say, if that's what you were asking. It sounded like, what the hell were you talking about?
No, it was clear. No, it was clear, but I just didn't get the full...
Where do I aim? Where do I aim with it?
Yeah. Yes. That's,
okay, thanks.
And can I add something quickly to that? Just so you're saying basically that positivism and all other philosophies are basically still, how should I say, they are an expression of bad metaphysics, so to speak, of liberal metaphysics. And you say before we, how should I say, you're looking for materialism that takes into account that every materialism is always a social relationship. An abstraction.
Well, I would say in some way, yes. In some way, yes. I don't know what you have in mind. I mean, I know what you write on, and I can just tell you that what I'm trying to say is not very different from what you usually try to say. So,
okay.
If that was the question.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, I guess probably that was the question.
Yeah. Verdinglichung. Okay. Thanks, Dan.
All right, thanks so much. We have another question from, I'm sorry, I'm not entirely sure how to pronounce your name, so my apologies.
This is a good question.
Yeah.
This is a good question, and it's a bit complex.
Just 1 second. There's Adam's question, but first there's a
Dauer's explanation of the right pronunciation, Verdinglichung, making reification. This would be the German word for it. Okay, so scientific Marxism. Yes, I actually do not pay attention to the possible confusion, so this is a good question. What one usually means when referring to scientific Marxism means the orthodoxies that existed and that were dominant in, let's say, the former socialist countries, in Yugoslavia, that was not so dogmatic, but still there was dogma, or in the Soviet Union. And, there was a lot of Hegelianism there, right? And actually, philosophy was present there, and it was called scientific because it was the type of, what it retained from Marx was, the ambition for Marxism to be scientific. But then the parties mainly, and the epistemological, ideological, whatever committees, kind of froze a certain version of dialectical materialism that was, the official position of the state toward what proper interpretation of Marxism should be. A couple of years ago, at the summer school where Davor was actually present, Stanimir Panayotov talked about a compatriot of ours, Blagoev, both Macedonian and Bulgarian, who was one of the founders of the Bolshevik Party and the first president of the epistemological committee. I was surprised that there was such thing as epistemological committee. So this committee is kind of decided what was scientific Marxism, whereas Laruelle's sense of Marx is a treatment of, actually it's a different treatment of not philosophical material, let's say conceptual material, than that of philosophy. Because in the introduction to non-Marxism, Laruelle says that Marxism and Freud's psychoanalysis are the only forms of thought of humanity, the attempts towards sense of humanities that have emerged from philosophy and managed to move away from it and were closest to establishing a proper sense of humanity under the condition of, reading the traditions of certain tenets of philosophy. So according to, and not just tenets in terms of content, but also in terms of approach. For example, the principle of philosophical sufficiency is something one ought to be rid of in order to speak of a science when we talk about Marxism, for example, also psychoanalysis. According to him, precisely dialectical materialism, the diamat, is the philosophical tenet and burden of Marxism. And in order to radicalize Marx, we have to get rid of it, basically. And he's correct because the doctrine of diamat is essentially Hegelian. So he is correct about it, and his scientific treatment of so his science of Marx, which would be a scientific treatment of the material provided by Marx, conceptual material, would be this, what I just presented. Then going to the determination or the identity of the last instance, here he uses almost interchangeably the two terms, and it turns out that it's labor, but he takes this notion of labor, which is actually an orthodox Marxian position, that the determination of the last instance of the entire tradition of thought or form of science would be labor or labor force. So this would be an orthodox position. So Laruelle goes back to it, affirms it, but then takes it a bit further and speaks of labor thought labor. So the position here being that the simple work of a philosopher, of of theory, of a theoretician, is labor as much as the practice, or that thought attempts to comment and contemplate on. So here he attempts to transcend the division between practice and thought, and he identifies this core of labor thought as the radical core of Marx, and this radicalization of Marxism would be called, according to Laruelle, non-Marxism, in the sense that it is non-philosophical Marxism. So when he says non-Marxism, or when I use the word non-Marxism, I mean non-philosophical Marxism that purports to be radical Marxism, not the opposite. And the term often creates a confusion and a complete misunderstanding.
Right, thanks. Ege, you've got a question, right?
Yes. Hello, Katerina, how are you doing?
Hello again. How are you?
Yeah, nice. The talk was great. It was very thought-provoking. Thank you for that. For just a small provocation, I would like to pose one quote to what would be a Laruellian interpretation of the quote, "Philosophy can only be realized by the abolition of the proletariat, and the proletariat can only be abolished by the realization of philosophy."
Well, I think I just responded to that. The paper responded to that. Do you think that the paper correlates with this dictum? Huh?
I think so, yes.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And I agree. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. This philosophical type of thought keeps us entrapped in this liberal identity-centered thinking, as if he predicted that we would end up there in this vicious circle of this type of politics, and wouldn't be able to develop a language that could address structural problems precisely due to philosophy. That is why his ambition was to create a certain science that would help the proletariat reach its consciousness. So I guess that's it, basically. Yeah, the quote kind of corroborates a little bit what I tried to present, I would say, or resonates similarly. Yeah. Thanks.
Right, thanks. We've got a question from Amanda.
Hey, thanks very much. And Katerina, I was wondering if you could say something a bit more about what I'm imagining to be the motor of objectivity in the way in which you're describing it. So what I was really interested in was how you talked about a critique of subjectivity does not land us back in the trap of subjective identitarianism, as you were just saying. But what it also does, I think you're saying, is that it occludes metaphysics, but also the problems of relativism. So if we're talking about a kind of objectivity that can get us out of the problems of subjectivity, relativism, and metaphysics, then I'm interested just to hear a little bit more about what, again, is the motor of the objectivity. So, for example, I'm thinking, if it relies on a certain politics of or idea of immanent critique, auto-critique, what is it that sustains objectivity that does not, like those other terms like relativism and metaphysics, all kind of include or promise a kind of either a measure or a judgment mechanism? So what I'm wondering is, in your, let's say, in your view of this objective science in the political, what conditions are there, if any, for a sense of evaluative measure, judgment, or any other terms like that? Or does it risk falling into, as you mentioned earlier, like what Althusser might term as like, in a pejorative sense, a spontaneous philosophy.
Yeah.
So I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that. Thanks.
Well, this is Marx's proposal, of course, that I build on. What he suggests is not so much a matter of semantics, as it is a matter of structure, I would say, or of a positioning, or what Laruelle would call a posture of thought. So the idea is not that, subjectivity does not exist, that subjectivity is irrelevant or anything of that sort. Of course it does exist, and of course we're embedded in it. We are subjects or subjects and humans in human, as Laruelle would say. So that thing is not denied by Marx. What he proposes is that we simply mime, imitate, like in mimesis, the position of a third-party perspective. So why isn't it positivism? Why isn't it absolutism of any sort? Because it does not have the ambition to be this, sub specia eternitatis gaze on the reality that would convey us the absolute truth. So it's another human being, or does not need to be human, but not a superior form of being to what a human is, because we cannot imagine one or cannot imagine in a way that we would mime it behavior. So a modest third-party perspective, I would say. So neither sub specia eternitatis, so neither theology, neither absolute knowledge, neither absolute reason of the theological kind, nor this subjectivity of. So the problem with positivism in Kant, for example, is that it presupposes this, super subject, this perfect scientific subjectivization, and the scientist that has accomplished this task of reading it was his back then, most probably, thought of any remnant of metaphysics is an impossible task, and it's also a task that mimes basically the absolute reasoning, or the reasoning in terms of the absolute, or sub specia eternitatis, whereby this perfect scientist becomes what God's gaze would be at the absolute truth. And Hegel's subject and his objectivization of the subject in the form of the absolute spirit is again this grotesque of human deployment in the form of universe. So what Marx proposes is to simply change the stance, and the ambitions are modest. This is the hard work of a scientist that slowly conquers the territory of the unknown through experimentation, to empirical study as well. For Marx, that is also important. Actually, his entire process, if you look at the Capital, is an empirical study that moves away from the concrete things that he discusses there and processes towards something more abstract, and extracts or extrapolates a formula out of this process. So simply a very modest task of, changing our position in this manner. it's a proposal more of this sort rather than, any prescription as to what we should think about or how we should think about things. So I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I guess I was thinking about this too, when you were talking, and I guess my question is really trying to think about the construction of such an entity through fiction, and how that reflexes upon, say, the difference between like logic, modal vocabularies, empiricism. In other words, like the kind of what is the governance of such a production, and I can think of so many people in.
It's always fiction, even when it's science or philosophy. It's always fiction, philo-fiction, right?
Yeah, but there's still rules. There are still rules.
Yeah. There, I guess
I'm talking about.
They're dictated, I would say, by the subject matter of inquiry. There is no general science. We can speak of a certain, formal category, a universal in this sense, of, a scientific stance of thought, or, it's again a certain metaphysical choice, actually. Because the scientist does not seek to conflate the real and thought, his or her or their explanation of the real. So a scientific treatment of reality always already affirms the foreclosure of the real. So the task is, in this sense, one of, simple cognitive labor, and that's it. So I think that what Marx proposes is very similar, but the ground rules, the methods are established in the process, as did Marx, whereby they are dictated by the subject matter. So the formula that exists in Capital, especially the third part, the third volume, I think that, no, the second is full of formulaic solutions. All of that is extracted from a very concrete object of inquiry, and only a posteriori has become, a formula and a rule and a certain standard. So, or take linguistics, so Syrian linguistics. It starts from something very concrete, like, the general course of in linguistics, Saussure. So there are these observations, of the phonetic rules and how the phonemes work, etc., etc. And then there is, beginning from this concrete, there is a further formalization of the argument. There is even one point where he uses almost the same phrase as Marx in the course on general linguistics, where he says, now we have moved away from the concrete, from the abstract, and we're departing from the concrete, but only in order to return to the abstract again. So I guess these two simple rules we find both in Marx and Saussure, some very basic ground rules, but the rest is probably dictated by the subject matter itself. I don't know. I don't have all the answers. Just, a couple of questions.
All right, thanks. It's 8 now, so if no one else has any more questions, I think we should be able to wrap up. Davor, do you have another question?
It's a comment here.
Yeah, I put an addition. Do you know the term Lysenkoism? Is it famous or is it known?
What? Lysenkoism?
Lysenkoism.
No.
Yeah, in the Soviet Union, they didn't believe in this, survival of the fittest, right? Because it was a capitalist notion of evolution. Therefore, they dismissed the whole branch of genetics, and they went back to Lamarck, right? And one of the apparatchiks, so to speak, I mean, as I can read here on Wikipedia, threw out like 3,000 biologists or something because they were, ideologically, so to speak, working with, science. So what I'm saying is there is the other side of your extreme. You see my point? So there's also, one can go, if one dismisses measurement itself as ideology already.
But this has nothing to do with Marx. What I'm saying is that Marx argued for the opposite from what we saw in the socialist countries as scientific Marxism.
No, okay, fine. I just wanted to with the question of positivism again. The point is, where do you, how should I say, where do you distinguish between ideology and pure empirical measuring, for example, or where do you distinguish between the technological progress that can happen and ideology in progress? You see, I can invent something, and I don't have to be a capitalist to invent something. You see, the problem is, it seems to me a little bit too rigorous to put everything that positivism is and everything that technological progress is already in the corner of ideology.
But I did not say that. I said that the problem with positivism is its ambition to produce an all-knowing, super subject of science. And
but you need that. That's the point. Everybody needs that. If you want to know something about the world, if you measure something, you're producing something that is kind of transcendent, objective, absolute, right?
No, it should be as formal as possible, I would say.
Yeah.
As rigorous as possible.
Okay.
It should be tested against the reality. So empirical study is indispensable. The whole thing is that you do not invest your entire effort in creating this super subject that is an unattainable goal, but rather simply change this position and mime what I just explained about the hard sciences, the proper, the STEM sciences. The only thing is that the difference is here is one of a metaphysical choice. Everything that stems from philosophy conflates truth and the real, and the ambition is absolute, and we have to cover everything absolutely, whereas the scientific thought is modest and very gradual in its accomplishments. And yeah, both, for example, and everywhere we can find metaphysics everywhere, even in the most progressive form of advanced form of science or scientific discovery nowadays. It's moved by a certain metaphysical ambition, one of which being, this omniscience of humanity, the dream of, knowing it all. And that is all right. This is what I'm saying. I mean, one should actually admit and affirm that there is a certain metaphysical position that kind of moves the practical process of scientific inquiry, and maybe examine, whether, as you put it, it's a good or bad metaphysics, and whether we want a different metaphysics. But I don't think that we can, just make it disappear. But it's useful for the sake of exactitude to admit it and face it and discuss it as such. Maybe see it as an ideological choice that can be debated.
Okay. Well, I should have said the question would just have been, what is the balancing between metaphysics and ideology? You know, is every metaphysics always ideology, or can it be also without ideology? And how does the shift, you know, the relationship, if they are distributed?
I think metaphysics is more rudimentary, but it inevitably ends up being ideology at some point, in a developed political context of social relations, kind of ends up.
And we should be aware of that, so to speak, reflect that all the time. No? The
Well,
possibility
let's
that
put
metaphysics
it
can become
that way now. Yeah, I mean, we could say so, yes. Or that should be matter of discussion as well. It's a myth that you can, produce science without the presence of this thing.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
All right, thanks. Yeah, Adam has another question, and then we should probably wrap up after that.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks. I don't know. This is actually a bit of a follow-up to Devor's comment, but I think it was also part of or detectable in Anne-Francois' talk a couple of days ago. And I think something that needs to be distinguished, and I think you were beginning to do it, Katerina, is I guess you could say that sort of the practice of actually existing science, which looks like a kind of, I mean, I'm engaged in a number of collaborations with bioengineers and biological sciences and complexity sciences and so forth. And, you know, the practice of actually existing science looks a lot like a kind of, you know, it's a philosophical science. It's a science that's infused with presuppositions, mobilizations, ways of sort of mobilizing discourses and certain things to be able to answer on behalf of other questions, to function as foundational. So, you know, and it's wrapped up in institutions. You know, science as a practice is wrapped up in institutions versus, you know, the kind of science that Laruelle talks about, which is a very different kind of science. It's a sort of non-philosophical science, which I always have a very difficult time actually imagining what that science looks like. I mean, we can, because I've never actually seen it in practice, you know, or when you read scientific papers, that science doesn't exist in institutions or as it sort of functions in the world today. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more. Maybe we don't have time for this, and maybe this is a much bigger project to think about, you know, the difference between the actual existing practices of science that, you know, STS scholars describe all the time, for example, versus the sort of non-philosophical science that Laruelle has in mind.
Well, I know that I have used Laruelle's method to discuss issues that are, perhaps subject matter of, you know, the social sciences and the humanities in a way that tries to be non-philosophical, so scientific in that way, rid of that principle of philosophical sufficiency that has opened for me the possibility to use, for example, Marxist science, or to use linguistics or other sciences in building an argument. When I first attempted to do this, I attempted it on feminist philosophy, so in the cut of the real. So I discussed gender. Actually, I discussed the treatment of feminist philosophy, which was, you know, at the time still, and it is still dominated by, you know, this Butlerian notion of gender, etc. So I tried to unpack certain concepts there that, according to me, inhibited, you know, a more structural critique of this gendered asymmetries and inequalities. So it's a rather abstract project, and its political and practical consequences are perhaps not visible once you read the book. but that's the intention, and it liberates, according to me, a certain potential that was inhibited by the post-structuralist feminist dogma. So there is this practical use I have attempted, and that product is something that I would call a product of Laruelle's, scientific way of doing philosophy. So simply by adhering to certain principles, such as, reading, moving away from the principle of, philosophical sufficiency, or assuming the posture of thought that at the same time affirms the foreclosure of the real, yet seeks to emulate it in a way, and through that, mime it, and through that describe it. Very similar to the Wittgenstein's mashup of of the structure of reality. So so I have used those tools provided by Laruelle's philosophy or methodology in doing something else, discussing something completely different, and I've arrived to interesting results, especially in the last book on the animals. So the treatment of the physical in by capitalism. There has been long philosophical and political conversations about this, and we are all aware of the problem, but there I attempted to establish a certain systemic analysis of how the automaton of valorization of capital can be likened, actually seen as a complete replica, I would say, of how philosophy treats the animal. So not nature, because nature is another abstraction, but the animal. So, the living physical beings, us being part of this species of animals, as the humans. So I call this this notion the non-human, following John Malarkey. And I kind of managed to formalize this. I don't know if I managed successfully. I formalized the argument with the help of Laruelle. How successfully, that's another question, and I have no say there. I cannot be the judge of my own success in that experiment. But these examples I've given you, I think, show what you can do. So it's a process you can engage in that you might call Laruelle, and does have this element of his scientific project. I explained at the beginning why they would be called scientific, in a treatment of all sorts of subject matters that come from philosophy, for example. So you can do that.
All right. Thanks so much. Yep, and thanks to Katerina, of course, for the brilliant talk, and to everyone who asked questions. Is the paper available to share with people, or is it for publication?
For publication, but this is Mariana. This is one of the students for credit, right? Yeah. From the institute, our students have signed up, Dimitar and Mariana. I can share it with you, Mariana, but in confidence. I mean, do not circulate it and do not cite it until I tell you to do so.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Katerina.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes, by the way, I would appreciate if you would share it with me too. You have my email, right, Katerina?
Yes. You are the ones enrolled for credit, so I'll send it to you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the same rules as for Mariana.
All right. Yep. Thanks again, everyone. And stay tuned for our upcoming lectures, which you'll receive information about soon. Which will go through June and July. So
maybe Adam has some information about the upcoming seminar. Adam, do you know when we'll be able to announce them?
Yeah, we've already announced them on our social media channels. So
we did.
Yeah, so you should be receiving information very quickly or soon.
Okay, great.
Yes, we have flyers and info going out. So
The flyers are great. Okay. Thanks, Doug.
Yeah. All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye. Bye.